All right, it's time to begin. Everyone, please keep your microphone muted and take it away, staff.
All right. Well, I am Kirk Beckendorf. I'm an environmental educator with Cascadia Conservation District. I want to thank you all very much for joining us this evening. We have a really exciting evening in store, and then a whole month of Mondays. So looking forward to all of this. So I'm going to introduce Amanda Newell.
Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Amanda Newell. I'm the Education and Outreach Specialist for Cascadia. And just give you a little background on who we are. We're a non-regulatory organization dedicated to encouraging the wise stewardship and conservation of all natural resources in Chelan County. So our board and staff work cooperatively with local landowners and communities to provide technical and financial assistance for soil, water, forest, fish, and wildlife conservation efforts. And we currently serve all of Chelan County. Next slide, please, Kirk. Thank you. So just a little more detail on some programs that we offer to serve our communities. And then, of course, we always love to hear from you. So we've got a website there and a phone number. So feel free to reach out to us anytime you have conservation questions. And then we just did want to mention that this workshop is being funded by the Washington Department of Ecology. So thank you to them for allowing us to bring this to you this evening.
So this month we have coming up every Monday, this whole series, seminar series on Native Planting 101, really designed for homeowners. Somebody actually asked me that today, is this for big landowners or somebody with their home? And it's really more geared for people with a home and wanting to know how to use native plants. So next week we have Al Murphy, who is actually joining us here tonight. I saw, nice to have you, Al. Oops, not sure where that's going. And he's going to be talking about using native plants to make your home fire-wise. And then March 15th, Julie Sanderson is going to be talking to us about how to manage weeds and deal with that major issue. Following week is native plant selection and maintenance. And then the last Monday in March, the 29th, we're going to have a panel discussion with all of these speakers, other than Mel. She's not going to be able to be with us. And so it'll be really more of a Q&A discussion for you can get more feedback from them. So we'll give you more information about that as we move along. So, but tonight we have Betsy Dudash using native plants in the landscape. And Betsy is from Purdue-trained landscape horticulturalist and designer, and she uses native plants in most of her designs. She's also a Wenatchee Naturalist and serves on the board of Sustainable Wenatchee. She also, there's a lot of alsos here, teaches, Betsy does a lot. So teaches continuing ed classes at Wenatchee Valley College. And if you Google Betsy, I don't know if she minds if I say that, you'll find lots of articles that she's written, lots of blogs, some very poetic ones, and all her recommendations on native plants and living sustainably. So Betsy, all yours. Thank you very much for taking time to share your knowledge with us.
You are most welcome. And now I'm going to share my screen. All right. Good evening, everyone. Normally, I'm going to go from the beginning. I'm a very interactive instructor normally, but because this is a larger group, like Amanda and Kirk said, we're going to have you submit questions to the, whatever that, the chat room.
The chat.
Yeah. And then I have 3 breaks in my presentation where we'll address a group of questions at a time, but definitely feel free to ask away. And if you're wondering, yes, I'm laying in bed because I had foot surgery 17 days ago, and I'm still kind of, in that space where I need to hang out here. So I'm going to talk about using native plants in the landscape. And ready, steady, go. Okay. So what is a native plant?
Hey,
It's kind of,
Betsy,
yeah, can you see me or hear me?
we can't see your screen.
You can't? Okay, hold on. Let me go back.
At least I can't.
No, I may have skipped a critical step of sharing screen. Okay, let's share screen. And then share.
There we go.
Can you see it now? Okay, thank you
Yep.
for that. And then from beginning. Okay, so let me start over. Okay, so if we're going to talk about using native plants, obviously the good place to start is by defining what they are, correct? So for our purposes, I'm going to offer a couple of definitions, and one is from the National Wildlife Federation. It says a plant is considered native if it has occurred naturally in a particular region, ecosystem, or habitat without human introduction. Another good one is a plant that is part of a balance of nature that is developed over hundreds or thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. Notice the emphasis on a particular region, not just a locale, but it's kind of a broader definition, and reason I like these. So what is a native plant? Again, for our purposes, we're going to be dealing with, hold on, I'm going to get rid of something. This goes in my, just put myself, hold on. Okay, see Kirk, and then we're gonna focus on species native to north central Washington, including the Columbia River Basin, Wenatchee River Valley, and the east side of the Cascades, as well as adjacent regions with similar ecosystems, especially the shrub steppe. And I thought I would focus on the shrub steppe because it's what most of Wenatchee and the surrounding area is. But the process I'm going to talk about will apply to you kind of no matter where you live. I know there's people in Leavenworth here and Okanagan County, and no matter what kind of habitat you live in or adjacent to, the steps I'm going to talk about apply to you. You'll just be using a different set of plants. So why do native plants matter? I mean, I think we all know that kind of native plants are an up and coming topic in not just in home landscaping, but for a lot of reasons. But they really do matter. It's more than an aesthetic choice. So number one is that habitat loss and fragmentation, pesticides, disease, and parasites are threatening pollinator and insect populations everywhere. Native plants have co-evolved over thousands of years with native fauna, including seasonal migrators, and provide food and shelter for animals of all shapes and sizes. And native plants will thrive in the right location without extra water, fertilizer, or pesticides. So there's a lot of good reasons to grow native. So the first thing we're going to talk about is before you figure out what you want to do, you say, okay, I want to include some natives in my landscape, or I have a new landscape and I want to plant it with natives. You have to figure out what you're trying to achieve with that. Oh, hold on. I always bump stuff. So, so there's this thing called design intent, which sounds like a fancy word, but it just really means the functional and aesthetic goals of your project. So you want to figure out, so like I said, you're trying to figure out what you want to achieve. You don't just want to start throwing plants in the ground. That's one of the reasons I'm really big on educating people about the design process, because I want you all to avoid a trap I'm sure more than one of us have fallen into, which is you see plants clearance somewhere and you do the, oh, I like that, I'll buy it, and then figure out what to do with it in your landscape, or find out that it won't grow without a lot of babying. So thinking about your design intent is going to be really important. So your design intent can be all encompassing. For instance, I want to turn my backyard into a wildlife habitat, or it could be a bunch of different separate goals. For instance, providing habitat for beneficial insects and birds, restoring a disturbed habitat, designing a landscape that blends in with adjacent wildlands, creating a wildflower garden or meadow, planting a hedgerow for privacy and diversity, or for education, for students or for the public. So in order to figure out what plants are going to grow in your landscape, you have to do some analysis and understand your site. This is not, I've told people, this is not the fun stuff. We're talking about site analysis, right? It's not super fun. It's not like, oh, look at the pretty picture. Look at the pretty plants. Not yet. We get to that. But first you have to understand what you're dealing with. So we'll be doing a brief overview of water grading and drainage, and water includes irrigation or lack thereof. Your soil types, soil type or types, sun exposure on your site, the local ecology in the areas closest to you, and any existing plants that you have in your landscape. So water availability, grading, and drainage on your site. And I'm just using Wenatchee as an example, but I believe Leavenworth is in the 12 to 18 inch range. You get to higher elevations, obviously you get more precipitation. But so Wenatchee averages just 9 to 12 inches of precipitation a year. Grading and drainage is most important as snow melts in the spring. So I'm from the Midwest where there's a lot of rain. So it's really important to understand that without irrigation or supplemental watering, plants that are just fine in landscapes in 50% of the country are not going to be okay where we live. We have a pretty distinctive ecosystem, several distinct ecosystems. So one of the things I want to remind you is that you always want to allow space for snow removal along walkways and driveways. That's kind of just put that in the back of your mind, which means no shrubs next to your walkway within like a 3 foot. I'm going to give you these little hints as I think of them. So ponding or wet areas could indicate you're watering too much. So we're going from, right now we're in the tail end of winter, and at some point people will start irrigating. So when it's irrigation season, you shouldn't have wet areas, especially in a desert. And I think that people who are on the irrigation water tend to overwater, but we'll talk about that a little more or not. By integrating native plants into your landscape, especially drought tolerant ones, will require you to rethink how you irrigate, whether you hand water, use soaker hoses, or have a built-in irrigation system. This is one of the points I want to drive home, is that you can't just swap plants out and not change how you water them. You have to have a plan, which is why we're talking about this. So the other exciting topic is knowing your soil type. I know that our yard has very, very sandy soil. I have other friends in Wenatchee who have a pretty clay soil. So by understanding your soil type, meaning is it well drained and it doesn't hold any water, or is it a heavy clay and has no drainage and holds water and has low aeration? It's kind of an important starting point. So quick definitions here are that fine textured soils, which are the ones with the high clay content, will hold more water than coarse textured soils, but have low oxygen holding capacity, meaning they have poor aeration. So my sand, my cucumbers, I grow along the fence in the summer. I have to water them at least once a day in mild weather and twice a day in the heat of summer, because the water just goes away. Coarse textured soils, like my sandy soil, have high permeability and low water holding capacity, making them suitable for only well-adapted plant species. So if you think about the shrub step, wherever you are, those are coarse textured soils where you have sand and gravel and just kind of just rocks and whatever, yet the plants that live there thrive because they are so well adapted. And then if you have medium texture soil, which are the loams, you can probably grow almost anything. So you think about loams, it's kind of your classic rich agricultural soil. And if you don't know what kind of soil you have and you want to get an analysis, you could use either Cascade Analytical in Wenatchee or Soil Test Farm Consultants. And I believe they're in Moses Lake and outside of Yakima, or another organization. Okay, and the other big one in the triad of kind of factors that will help you choose your plants is the sun exposure on your site. So we define full sun by greater than 6 hours a day, but some plants might actually need 8 to 10 hours a day. I'll give you an example of that. I have snow buckwheat in my front yard, and on one side it's full sun, and the other side it's partially shaded by an ancient lilac tree. And the ones in the full sun are easily 3 times, if not 4 times bigger than the ones that just get a little bit of shade. So it does matter. For part sun or part shade, excuse me, is defined as 3 to 6 hours of direct sun per day, but it should be morning or late afternoon sun. So something that's getting part sun or part shade won't do well with that beating hot sun of midday. Shade means less than 3 hours of sun a day, morning or evening sun, or dappled or indirect light. And the sun exposure is going to vary across different parts of your yard and will change as trees mature. People need to remember that. Trees grow, plants grow, and that will affect the sun exposure. So I'll use my yard as an example. On the north side, we have full shade all the time. Backyard is some dappled, some full sun, and then the west and front yard, full sun. So we have to plan and plant accordingly. So what I'm going to talk about next is probably the most, what I consider the odious of the tasks here. Because if you're going to do a serious assessment of your property, you have to understand what plants you already have there. So you're going to survey and assess your existing plants. So basically that means putting together a list of all the plants you want to keep. And again, you're going to understand that if you have existing trees, they'll create shade, but if they're non-natives, especially, they can be water hogs, and you're going to not want to plant too much under them. And know that non-native shrubs generally can be relocated. Native shrubs is where you get into do they have a taproot or don't they have a taproot? So I'll use a non-native as an example, the burning bush, which builders love. They're small, you can buy them anywhere, they're cheap, and they grow fast. But even at a large size, like a 6-foot burning bush, actually is pretty easy to dig up because it has a really fibrous root system. But if you tried to do that with, say, I don't know, pick a native, probably not going to be successful. So in your analysis, non-natives are going to be fairly easy to relocate. And the same applies to most non-native perennials and ornamental grasses. They can either be divided or relocated in spring or fall. But I would steer away from dividing grasses in the fall. They can be a little finicky about that. And when I say most non-native, that doesn't really apply to something like, say, coneflower, which is native where I come from. And it has a taproot as well. So when you think about if something is going to be easy to move or not easy to move, think about the kind of root system it has. It will really help your decision making. And then plants, as you're planning, you're looking at your list of plants you have, and you're starting to think about what you want to do. You need to remember that plants with moderate or high water needs will need to be clustered together. So we'll kind of simplify your irrigation planning. Put them away from drought tolerant natives. This is all part of the first step of the planning process. Okay. Any questions about analyzing your site conditions or any of the topics we've talked about so far?
Feel free to put them into the chat. And Betsy, somebody asked if you were going to share the PowerPoint.
I am. Oh, yes. You mean to email? Yes.
Yeah. Well,
I'll turn it into a PDF file, and then yes, I'll email it to Kirk and he will happily share it, right? Yeah.
Yep.
There are some chats. Wait.
Yep. And somebody just asked about how much rain does Chelan get?
Chelan is, I
that?
checked that for a class I taught last year, and Chelan is pretty close to Wenatchee. I imagine it changes as you get up in the higher elevations, but I think it was in the 9 to 11 or something similar. Don't quote me on that, but it's what I remember. Leavenworth is substantially higher, and if you get up into Lake Wenatchee area, that's even more, obviously. So it really depends on your locality. Provide lists of natives. So there is a list of resources in at the end of my presentation, and it will help. It definitely helps, and I'm going to talk about a couple in particular. And wind exposure and effect on native plants. So that is going to be that's another big question. When I say full sun, the big three are going to be the water, the soil, and the sun, but wind exposure is definitely an issue. So the tough drought tolerant natives are going to be more tolerant of the wind exposure because of the adaptations they have, whether it's the fuzzy leaves or the 7 to 12 foot taproots or things like that. Please send me your contact info. Didn't mean to send that. Is there a minimum distance to keep more water hogging plants from native plants? Basically, and I think I talk about this, or maybe not, because I changed this for this particular presentation, but you want to think in terms of zones. As far as, generally speaking, you want plants that need more water. This is how it's just easier to be closer to your house. And then you'll transition to plants that need more water, less water. And then the most drought tolerant will be further away. But however you decide to do it, you want to designate areas. If that makes any sense at all, it'll just be much simpler to do. Purple prayer natives, perhaps not from here. So, Jean, for our purposes, not from here, natives, what I was talking about specifically tonight are kind of regional, and I'm thinking like the shrub steppe through the Intermountain area over to probably Montana, maybe into the Dakotas, and then down into Colorado and parts of California probably share some of our same, there are areas that share some of our same habitat. What I said about planting zones, as far as water, as far as watering, you want to group plants with similar watering needs together. And really, there's a lot of variation in typical landscape plants, but in the drought tolerant natives especially, you do not want to water them. Okay, you don't want to overwater them. You don't want them to rot. So it's going to be really critical not to do that. But we will talk more about that. Okay, any other questions? And Lola, I see your message, and I will message you separately. Any more questions? Taproot is what is a native plant? Yeah, so a taproot, so throwing the horticultural terms around, but think of your tomato plant. So end of the season, you're pulling your tomato plant out of the ground, and there's a whole bunch of fibrous roots. Those are called fibrous, where you just a big mass of roots. A taproot, there will still be some roots at the top, but taproots go really deep. They go deep, 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 because roots look for water. Plants grow new roots every day, new root cells every day, and their job is to find water. They're just going and going down. So, okay, I'm glad that helped.
Like a carrot would be a taproot.
Yes, a carrot is a taproot. That's a great example. It's a taproot we eat, like turnips. They're taproots. Yes, balsam root. That's a taproot. Curly dock, which is a weed. That's a taproot. Yeah. But that's going to be a really a big factor in your current landscape, whether or not you can move plants around. It's just not worth trying to move plants with the taproot. It's better to get some babies and try again. All right. Any more?
And we'll have additional Q&A as
Yeah,
we go along too. So.
We have 2 more Q&As. So good. All right, now we move on. Oops. I think there we go. So actually this is kind of going over what I just talked about and then leading into the creation of your plant palette, which is where the fun starts. So to reiterate, your water, soil type, and sun exposure are the main limiting factors limiting which plants will thrive in your landscape. In order to minimize your supplemental watering and, save money and eventually the environment, right? You want to choose plants that are adapted to local precipitation amounts. If you have native soils on your site, look to nearby wildlands for plant inspiration. For instance, in Wenatchee, it's really easy to go to any of the trails in the foothills here, and the plants you see are plants that you can be pretty sure are going to grow in your soil. If you have soil that's been amended with lots of organic matter, you can expand your plant palette. So if you see something that will take the sun and the heat, but needs a richer organic soil, you could probably add it to your palette. And then I'm going to say for, I think, the 3rd time at this point, as trees grow, the sunlight on your property will change. It's just really a lot of people seem to forget when you put a plant in the ground, it's going to grow. And especially with trees, you need to understand that a 1.5-inch caliper tree with maybe a 5-foot canopy in 10 years might have a 15-foot canopy, and in 20 years might have a 30-foot canopy. It's really important to understand how the plants are going to grow, what's going to happen. And this is especially important because if you have full sun plants, they won't do well in full shade, and full shade plants won't do well in full sun. So landscapes grow, gardens change, you spend a little time and may end up swapping plants out. So we're going to talk about building a plant palette. And basically, just a quick definition is that a plant palette is all the plants that you think you might want to use. And you build it from different factors. So let me talk a little bit about. So if you think of a palette, painters use a palette. You go to make a painting, you put down the colors that you want to use for that particular painting. And you don't always use all the colors, but and then you're going to create your painting using those colors. So your plant palette is basically your master list of plants you like that fit what you want to do, what you can do. So number 1 goal, because we're talking about natives, is to choose plants that are already adapted to your site conditions. And what are they again? They are water, soil, and sun exposure. Those are the big 3. Other factors, as someone pointed out, wind is another factor, etc. So how do you start putting together this master list? So when you're out hiking, take pictures, look in books, use online resources. If you haven't been to DerbyCanyonNatives.com, I'm going to mention this site more than once. Terrific resource. Ted lists plants sizes, their sun and shade exposure, if they're drought tolerant or if they need water or moisture, bloom periods, color of blooms, all sorts of factors. Huge resource. And going through all this, and I want to remind you guys that building your plant palette is something you're going to start. It's not going to happen overnight. In fact, this is kind of going to be a project that you will, I assume, add to over months and years as you see new plants that you go hiking somewhere and you see a plant and you're like, hey, I kind of like that. So you're just going to keep building on it. But what you're going to do is your list is going to break plants down by shade trees, ornamental trees, shrubs, grasses, perennials, and ground covers. And just a word about ground covers is kind of a loose term from a horticultural perspective. A lot of things can be ground covers. Anything that's going to grow and fill a large area can be considered a ground cover. Primarily grasses and low grasses and perennials, but also shrubs, quote unquote shrubs like kinnikinick. That's generally used as a ground cover. So you're going to do that, and you're going to focus on plants that match the site conditions and your preferences. So whether there's colors you definitely want to use, colors you hate and don't want in your landscape, if you want to attract pollinators, if you want to feed birds. And I thought of something that I didn't include on this, but like for me, when we're looking at my plant palette, because we're going to use me as an example, I love fluffy plants, loose, fluffy, flowing. Other people like neat, tidy mountains of plants, you know, so that is another factor to take into consideration when you're building your plant palette. And the way to do it is going to be completely up to you. My master plant palette that I use for myself and for students and clients is a couple of pages, an Excel spreadsheet, but that works for me. You might find that you might want to put together a Pinterest page or a PowerPoint presentation for yourself that has pictures and the plant names and other information. This is something that you're going to work on, like I said, and you're just going to build on it for a long time to come. So I'm going to share my personal plant palette, kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So my plant palette for trees is very limited because we have a very small urban yard in Wenatchee. So the only tree that works in my landscape is Douglas maple. And the limiting factors being the small yard, the sandy soil, and no irrigation. And as we go through my list, I had talked about how sun exposure varies around the yard. And the Douglas maple, it can take part shade, it can take sun, so it works for me. Actually, I have a little one in the ground. And let me say, make a note about using the botanical name, because you'll notice that I use the common name and botanical name on every species. And there's a very important reason I do that, is because common names can vary. I mean, they can vary from region to region, or, you know, the other side of the country. So Douglas maple, Acer glabrum, is also known as, oh, it has another name, Rocky Mountain maple. I think it might be a subspecies, but we know by saying Acer glabrum, everybody knows what you're talking about. And any nursery worth their salt will always use a botanical name. So you know what you're getting. Okay, then we're going to go on to shrubs. So here's the kinnikinick, which is used as a woody ground cover. So depending on what nursery site you're looking at, or whatever, could just be listed in woody plants, or could be listed as a shrub, just a very low shrub. And for me, rabbit brush is a great plant to include in my palette because it has a late season bloom. It's a small size, and it's just got that terrific color. And ocean spray is another one, a bigger one, and serviceberry, which if I had to pick one plant that everyone should try to include in their landscape, their native plant landscape, it would be serviceberry. You got the white blooms that attract pollinators. Then you've got the berries that feed birds and other animals. And then you have not great, but sometimes better than not great, fall color. I mean, it's got everything, and it doesn't get too big. Very attractive plant. So that's the start of my list. So you'll notice, you know, when you're putting together, and this isn't my complete plant palette, by the way, I'm sharing parts of it with you guys because I have a wish list. I'm a horticulturist. There's a lot of plants I love and would use in my landscape if it were a little bit bigger, or there are plants that I'm experimenting with. So So more shrubs is the red flowering currant and the wax currant and purple sage. So a note about the currants, there's 3 currants that are generally available. And the biggest differences between them when you're thinking about what do I want to use are the bloom colors and the size and the fruit color. So as if you're like, oh, I don't want those, crazy hot pink flowers. I like the subdued ones, or I like the yellow ones. Those are all factors you're going to take into consideration. So just remember that you're building your plant palette for you, for your landscape, you want to make your yard, your garden, your landscape yours. You want it to make you happy. You want to walk out there and go, I just love that plant. It makes me happy. In the bottom right here, there's the purple sage, which first time I saw it in bloom in the wild, I literally gasped and I recognized it right away. It's a tough little shrub, doesn't get too small, too big. And I just love purples, especially when you throw them in the landscape with maybe some whites and yellows. They look fabulous. So, and grasses. So one of the things that people think about when they see grasses, especially where we live in a desert, the first response is like, wait, but aren't those a fire hazard? And Al Murphy is going to be talking about fire-wise landscaping next Monday, as Kirk pointed out. But the thing to remember about using these grasses in your landscape is that you control how much water they get. So what I do with mine is a little bit of extra water, maybe in the heat of the summer, is probably all it's going to take to prevent them from going dormant and turning brown and being not only a fire hazard, but, no fun to look at. So that's why I include them. And I happen to love grasses, and they come in so many different sizes and textures and are great for our little pollinator friends, and the seeds feed the birds. So there's more grasses coming up. I'm wondering, should I, hold on, talk more in detail about these? But just on there's Indian rice grass, which is just a beautiful, light, finer textured. The bottlebrush squirrel tail in the middle it has the cutest blooms ever. I'm getting all fluffy here, but the blooms are adorable. And I read a study last year, the year before, that it's potentially, and I'm just going to say potentially, useful in outcompeting cheatgrass. So you have a cheatgrass problem and you're pulling the cheatgrass and trying to control it. It might not be a bad idea, or it might be worth, spending a little on seed to try this. What I read is it's not a long-lived grass, but it would self-seed and hopefully spread. So who knows? And then pine grass is just amazing, and it works well in shade and full sun. And it happens to be a cousin of a really common landscape grass that I see around Wenatchee, which is the Carl Forster feather reed. This is total different beast, but they're cousins botanically. Okay, so more grasses, because like I said, right? June grass is just kind of medium size and cool. Another favorite of mine is the Basin Wild Rye. So if you've been hiking basically anywhere in the region and you come upon a big, bold grass that's about my height, I'm 5'3.5", Basin Wild Rye. And if you're looking for kind of a statement or an accent grass, that would be the one. And then Idaho Fescue, and all the Idaho Fescue I have in my yard are gifts from my friend Sherry and Bob. It's a very prolific ground cover. They have a lot of the little plants. It seeds, and it's a low plant and easy care. So I like that one too. So let's talk about perennials. I'm gonna make sure I'm not gonna run over here. So, okay. So what I mentioned earlier, I tend toward the fluffy plants. They have a lot of, they spill over, or they They're soft in some way. We have showy milkweed, the snow buckwheat, which is poof, right up there in my top perennials of all time, pearly everlasting. And I want to make a note about milkweeds. I read an article a couple weeks ago that research seems to indicate that milkweeds will be more effective to attract monarch and other butterfly populations if they're on the perimeter, if they're not mixed in with other plants. So just kind of take note of that. I would say, like, I put mine in the no man's land between the driveway and the house, which was just gravel when we moved in. I have a big clump of milkweed in there. And also on this list, silky lupin, which is one of the lupins that is a desert species, and then western goldenrod, which I'm not showing you pictures of, but some of them. Other plants, the Scarlet Gilia is actually a biennial, but if you're looking for a red that's just gorgeous, that's one. And the red Columbine, if you see it hiking, you'll notice it's probably in kind of a partly shaded area, maybe near a creek. And that's one of the few plants I put on my personal list that is a part shade plant. So I have a spot where I think it's going to go this year or next year because it's close to a water spigot, completely shaded part of the house, so that heat of July and August shouldn't hurt it too much. And then on the bottom is the orange globe mallow, which the color orange makes me happy. And this is a fun little plant. And then when I was talking about ground covers, Coyote Mint is a low mint. I want to say it's like 8 inches high. A great ground cover. Ted Alway has a big patch of it at Derby Canyon Natives. And that's another plant that was included in a list I saw recently of kind of super pollinator plants, where it's one of the plants that attracts a really broad range of pollinators. So it would be worth considering using to attract pollinators. And then the penstemons, and there are too many, and I love them all mostly. So there's a lot of them. Finally, I think this might be the end of my perennials. Blanket flower, which is the Gaillardia, blue flax, and showy daisy. So blanket flower is one of the first plants I put in our front yard. And I'm just going to say I give it a tiny bit of water every once in a while, and it blooms from April or May into October. It's fantastic. And then if you want to attract native bees, it's covered with native bees, especially the little mason bees. So, and then blue flax is just, the color is stunning. Showy daisy is another part shade plant. And Indian paintbrush, I didn't include specific species because depending on where you live, there's, the yellow and orange and red. Some of them occur around Wenatchee. Some of them are up in Lake Wenatchee, and they need more water. So that's very dependent on where you are. And then, of course, there's the arrowleaf balsam root, which is another great one. So, so our first step here in learning how to design, check my time, I'm going to speed this up a little. I'm just going to include a quick example. A quick way to introduce natives into your landscape is to put together a pollinator garden. So the trick is just to include enough different species to provide flowers spring through fall. And I've got some lists on the following pages. You can just stick with perennials and annuals if you have a small space, or if you have a larger area, you can include trees, shrubs, and grasses as well. Now the list, I'm just gonna, oh, there we go. So any questions? Let me see what we have here. I know I covered a lot of material. Deer resistant pellet list. I think Ted on the Derby Canyon Native site does have a list of plants that are deer resistant. Now, the caveat in saying deer resistant is that we all know that if deer are hungry enough, they will eat pretty much anything. So just think about that. Okay, Al Murphy suggests for outcompeting cheatgrass, He would offer Sandberg's bluegrass as a great species. Thanks for that, Al. That's useful. Is coyote mint edible? I don't know. Most of the mints family are. So that is, I don't know. Absolutely don't know that question. So any other comments on that? Questions? Okay, I'm starting from scratch. Yes. Do the same design principles still apply? Yes. If you have a brand new landscape, meaning probably the builder scraped away your topsoil, and you probably have a lot of weed seeds in there, because weed seeds can live for a very long time. Let me go back up there. I'm losing a question. Then yes, you still need to analyze your soil, your water. Although if you're installing a new system, it's a better time to make those decisions. And definitely analyze your sun, because one of the things I didn't mention about sun exposure is that the height of your house and the height of your neighbors' houses, those are all factors. The reason I have a shady north side of the property, a yard, is because the house creates the shade. Gonna hold on. I think I lost a question. I'm gonna pull this up bigger.
Betsy, I can read it for you too, if that's helpful.
Okay.
I think it was oh, you got it now?
Yeah, I did. I made it bigger.
Okay.
Do grasses spread out of the area you plant them? In other words, can I plant a small radius of a grass? All the grasses that I've included are clump grasses. In other words, they don't send out, they're not going to spread in that manner. They will seed. The seeds will scatter, but yes, you can do that. So the same principles apply. Quick tips on replacing lawns. Quick tips on replacing lawn. There's no quick way to do it. There are like 3 different options. Quickest way is, and my least favorite would be to spray Roundup, let it die, and then plant in that area. My least favorite. Another way would be to, if you have irrigation, to turn off the water, let it die. You need to let it die, and you need to mow it really, really low. And if it's truly dead, you can then plant through it, or you can take a sod cutter, cut the sod and flip it over. You don't have to go too deep. And the third way would be to cut off irrigation, mow it really low, take a sod cutter, and then flip it over. Best grass seed mix for Chelan with fine grain tight soil. I'd have to check on that. Some good research. Squirrel tail. For one of the quick resources is the Zero C Society. If you don't follow them on Facebook, or it's an amazing organization dedicated to preservation of pollinators and other invertebrates. So that's a quick answer to that. As far as resources for following research, I just specifically look for things at times. So if you think about a topic you might be interested in, I just do a search. But probably the extension offices for the various states, for Washington and Oregon and Montana, those are all good resources to go searching for. Slope stabilization plants will be basically any of the natives that have that establish quickly and send down taproots. That's a quick and dirty answer. But there's almost anything we're talking about could be used to stabilize a slope, but probably the easiest way to do it is with perennials and grasses, because of the fact of getting plants established. Or you could use shrubs, native shrubs, but plant them as smaller plants, not as large plants. When you're planting on a slope, you want to try to make it easy as possible and to avoid disturbing the soil. That's probably going to be key to that. Yes, Derby Canyon Natives has a list of deer resistant plants. Yeah. Moved into a new house, owner had rock around the house. Is it better to clear the rock to the soil or use planters? I have rock in that area, in the no man's land between the driveway and the house. And in order to plant in there, I just moved the rocks away. It's gravel, landscape gravel, and cut the fabric that was there and planted and then moved it back. But as the plant grows, you have to make sure you're moving the rocks further and further away. So yeah, you can do either way. But if you want to use natives, you're going to have more success planting in the soil. Any of the shrubs suggested good for a privacy hedge? Yeah. Off the top of my head, the serviceberry is terrific, and ocean spray and the currants, whichever is the tall, I think the red flowering currant is maybe 5 to 6 feet, but any of those plants. So if you go to Derby Canyon Natives website, you look at the height of the plants, and that is the mature height, and that's a good guide for that. Okay. Okay. We are on schedule, so I'm going to keep moving on. Okay. Okay, so I'm just gonna not even gonna go through these, or I will quickly go through these. Okay. So I broke this up. I found this on a really great site that's cited at the end. But native pollinator plants for areas with 9 to 12 inches of annual precipitation. And the trick with these is, as I mentioned earlier, the real trick to a pollinator garden is to make sure you have something that's going to bloom from spring. So here we have balsam root through fall. So rabbit brush. And this would be somewhere I want to mention, don't forget annuals. So we have yarrow, blanket flower, blue flax. But don't forget annuals. I discovered yellow bee plant last year, and I'm kind of smitten. I have seeds. It's an annual. It's a native annual, as we define native. And there's other buckwheats, obviously, not just snow buckwheat. Goldenrods and grasses, the blue bunch wheatgrass. So native pollinator plants for areas with 12 to 18-inch annual precipitation. These obviously will still work in Wenatchee as long as you're doing a little bit of supplemental watering, and they won't all need that supplemental water, but think about that. And if you have a space and if you have water, willows, a willow shrub of some sort, probably the mountain willow, the Sculler's willow, would be a really good choice, because willows, they bloom early. So they're a pretty important early food for pollinators. But again, you have to have the space and you have to have the water. So we're going to quickly run through how you're going to design your landscape. And this is the Betsy's crash course in being a landscape designer. So all right, so you're going to plan before you plant. And you're going to start with a scaled sketch of the area you're working on. And when I say scaled sketch, I mean you're going to go buy some graph paper, and they have the big, or you're going to text me and say, hey, can I borrow a sheet of graph paper? Because I have a couple of those. So you're going to either work with 1/8 inch scale, which means that 1/8 inch equals 1 foot, 0 inches. So whatever you draw, something 1/8 of an inch on the paper is 1 foot. Or if you're looking at just a garden area or a smaller area, you can work at quarter scale, which means that 1/4 inch equals 1 foot. And when I say area working on, I recommend, as you dip your toe into the designing with native plants and working with them, that you start with a small area. Like I said, a pollinator garden is a great way to start. So, and the area you're working on means you're also going to include, if you have the house, the sidewalk, walkways, garage, driveway, any features like that, you're going to include. And as you're doing this, I want to remind you to stick with basic design principles because you don't want to create chaos. We all have heard people tell us that, you know, native plants are weeds, and if you create a chaotic, weedy looking landscape, you're just going to kind of feed into that mythology. You're going to follow Firewise design principles, which Al will talk about next week. But in a nutshell, it means that you shouldn't put flammable mulches or plants like sagebrush near your house. That's the quick and dirty version of that. And you have your scaled sketch, then you're going to sketch in the main plants, plant masses, lawns, paths, and hardscapes. And then again, you're going to group plants. And so when I'm talking about main plants, you're also going to include the plants that you want to keep. So if you have a big shade tree or ornamental trees or shrubs, you want to put those in so you know where they are. And then you start sketching and figuring out the other stuff. And if you have existing paths or hardscape, and when I say hardscape, I mean, retaining walls and pergolas and patios and fences and all that good stuff. You want to include all that. And then we're going back to this for the third or fourth time, right? You're going to group plants by the amount of water they need. And there's no hard and fast rule for that. But as I said, it's easier generally to put the plants that require more water closer to your house. And then as you get further away, the plants that need less. And then finally on the perimeter mainly, or in designated areas, the super drought tolerant ones that once they're established, they won't need water at all. Maybe, you know, a couple times in August or something. So on your plan, you're going to label the plants generically. So you're going to say, oh, I want a tall grass or a small tree. Then you're going to assign specific plant names. Like my tall grass is going to be, Basin Wild Rye, of course. Flowering shrub, I really want a rabbit brush. And then finally, you're going to label the plants and the quantities on your final landscape plan. And if you use abbreviations and a plant key, it's super helpful. So a couple tips on that. So yeah, that's like the world's fastest design course, right? But basic planting design, because we're just going to get right under the wire with this. Don't overwhelm a small space and don't skimp in a large space. Trees and shrubs are going to form the backbone of your landscape. So focus on them. You're going to plant in groups of 3, 5, 6, or more, except for a few specimen plants. You're going to arrange your plants in layers, shortest plants closest to you. And if you have retaining walls of some sort, you want to think about plants that are going to spill over those retaining walls. You want to respect the house or the neighborhood style. You want to frame your view, don't block it, and use color intentionally, and don't forget about annuals. So, questions about the design process. Like I said, it's the quickest design course in history. Okay, let me see if I can get this right. Why put, okay, what about lead plant? Good privacy. What about lead plant? I don't know that one. We're specifically talking about natives. So non-natives, of course, our landscapes are all going to be mixed. So a non-native that is also drought tolerant is a good option. Putting plants that need water close to the house is just easier logistically, especially if you're like me and you don't have an in-ground irrigation system. Good drought tolerant shade tree. You're welcome, Jean. Good drought tolerant shade tree. Wow. What comes to mind on that are probably big leaf maple, which will be less. It won't be as big and huge as you would find it in like Leavenworth area, but they will grow here. There are actually some behind Castle Rock, my friend Rick told me, and they are a little bit stunted. Lavenders and mass good from Manson area. Lavenders are not native, but they are pretty drought tolerant and people love them. You're welcome, and you're welcome. Any more questions? Plants requiring Great Firewise. Oh yeah. Thank you, Al. That's the other reason putting plants that need more water close to the house is great Firewise, 2 for 1, because a high moisture content makes plants fire resistant. Thank you for pointing that out. Oh, you're welcome, Brenda. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. And so the last pages, quickly, seed and plant sources. And Okanagan County folks, I know that there at least used to be a little native plant nursery in Twist, but I'm assuming it's still there. Mulch. What kinds of mulch are best to use? It depends on your location. And I think Al will probably talk about that next week. Grasses that are shade tolerant, pine grass is a good one. It deals with a lot of shade. And Kirk just shared a list that has some of my resources on it. Yes.
So what she has on this page, and I think the next one.
Yes.
So unless that way you don't have to try to write down all those, you can get to that Google Doc and they're all on there.
So seed and plant sources, and then I've got some other resources in there. And one of them is Xerces Society. This is one note, but they are an amazing organization. This amazing booklet published by the Methow Conservancy, I think Kirk looked, and they have a PDF version. And my contact information, go back. BFI Native Seeds, so Derby Canyon Natives, BFI Native Seeds, and Mel Asher, who's speaking on the 22nd, works for BFI Native Seeds. But yeah, they are included in that document Kirk shared, and I will be sharing a PDF of this whole presentation. Let me check the last 2 questions. Yes. Yes, I do design and consultation. Okay, anything else before we wrap up?
Well, thank you, Betsy, very much. Sure appreciate it. And everybody who joined us, thank you also. And again, next week, Monday, Al's going to be joining us and talking about Firewise. Betsy will get us the PDF for her presentation. I'll email that out to everybody. And we're going to be compiling a list of resources from all the speakers. And then at the end, I'll send out that compiled list of resources. I know there are several questions about resources, so we'll get those out as we go. Amanda, do you have anything else?
Nothing from me. Just thank you for joining us this evening, and we hope to see a lot of you next week, or next session.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Have a good night.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks again, Betsy.
You're welcome.
Good job, Betsy.
Thank you, Al.